So welcome to the next video in the series around needs finding and specifically observational market research. So to dig into scoping just a little bit further, I think about scoping and in fact the whole process of research as a funnel. At the top of the funnel we have a very broad opening, at the bottom a very narrow. So in this example I've taken air travel as an example. And air travel, if you just looked at air travel getting from Pittsburgh to San Francisco, there would be thousands of needs along the way, in the airport, on the aeroplane, at the airport on arrival, maybe the journey to and from the airport, etc. An awful lot to look at. You could conceivably do that, but it would take a long time and a lot of resources. So very typically you might say, well, actually I'm going to scope down here, I'm going to narrow down, perhaps to just look at the airports. But if you think on reflection, that's still pretty huge, because you could have needs relating to aircraft operations, but also buying a hamburger. There's an awful lot going on in an airport. So you might narrow further and think, well, let's look at passing through security. Let's look at the kind of TSA checkpoint and how passengers get from one side, from the ticketing side, to the air side of the airport. If that was still too broad, you might narrow down further to a part within that process, perhaps the screening of bags, and bags going onto the conveyor through the X-ray machine and how they're screened. So that's where your team and your research, you talk about what you're going to do, what you're trying to achieve, and how broad your scope and your level of ambition is. Let's just say we took bag screening as an example. That might yield hundreds of needs. Trust me, it might. Very typically, the next step in the process is that we think about, well, of those hundreds of needs, which are most valuable? Which do people care about? Which are going to make the most difference to people if we went on to solve them? And you probably discard some as a result of that analysis and maybe arrive at tens of needs. In a typical, maybe business situation, the next question we'll often ask is, well, okay, people care about that, but how many of them are there? Equally, if you were in a global health setting, it might be, well, how many people would be impacted by this innovation? And then from the bottom of that funnel, you yield very specific unmet needs or problems that need to be solved. So that's scoping, and it's a funnel. Try and figure out where in that funnel you need to be, and that might be based on the resources you have and the time you have available.